Hello students, today we are going to discuss properties of IS curve. In part 1, we have already discussed how to derive IS curve from product market equilibrium schedule, and the IS curve we derived was like this, a downward sloping curve in in Y and R plane. So when you measure rate of interest along the vertical axis and income along the horizontal axis, you can represent the product market equilibrium condition in terms of a curve which is known as investment savings curve, which is also known as product market equilibrium schedule or IS curve. Okay, so this is the first part was about derivation of IS. Now here what we are going to discuss is we are going to discuss some of the properties of IS curve. So let's start. So first of all, we want to talk about slope of the IS curve. As you know from our derivation itself, that IS curve is a downward sloping curve like this. So we already know that the slope is negative and we know the logic behind it. Because if you remember the logic and how the IS curve derivation of the IS curve was done, it was from our product market equilibrium condition. Okay, this was the product market equilibrium condition. This is the product market equilibrium condition, and from this condition, what we did was we considered R0 first at R first at R0, and then correspondingly we got 1 equilibrium income at Y0. So this was our first point here at E0. Then what we did is we reduced R from R0 to R1. So if you consider another R which is lower than, which is smaller than the initial one, like this one, if you reduce R, what is going to happen? If you consider the equilibrium condition, and then as you know, this is if you lower R, investment is going to increase, because investment is inversely related to the rate of interest. Now if investment increases, then this aggregate demand is basically increasing, right hand side is basically increasing. Then what will happen? You will have to bring back equilibrium. You will have to consider another Y which is higher than the initial one. So instead of Y0, you are getting a higher Y, which is say Y1. So corresponding to a lower value of R here, you are getting a higher value of Y. So clearly, so if you plot those 2 points and draw a locus of all those points, I mean, we are talking about only 2 points, but there are numerous points here. So if you draw a line through it, or if you draw a curve through it, whatever, then you will get a curve which is IS curve, because the logic, the logic, I mean how it is working. If you understand the working of this logic, then you can easily understand why the relationship is why the IS curve is downward sloping, right? But we can do that easily by using simple mathematics like this. Okay, let me erase these things first. So if you have the product market equilibrium condition like this, what do? You just totally differentiate this equation, keeping g bar constant. G bar is constant, and we are not doing any comparative statics here. So what we are doing is we are getting from y, this is dy equal to c prime dy minus t prime dy plus I prime dr. I prime dr means del I del r dr. Okay, so there is no dg bar because we are not doing any comparative statics and g bar is constant, so dg bar is basically equal to 0. Now you take them to the left hand side, then this is basically 1 minus c prime into 1 minus d prime dy, and right hand side is basically I prime dr. Then if you rearrange terms like this, if you want to find out slope of is, because remember in this graph we are measuring r vertically on the vertical axis and y on the horizontal axis, so the slope of is curve is basically dr dy, right? Because we are measuring y vertically and r vertically and y horizontally. So if you find out dr dy from this step, then what is the value? The value is 1 minus c prime into 1 minus t prime divided by I prime. And remember, this c prime into 1 minus t prime, this is basically MPC. This is basically marginal propensity to consume out of total income, okay? And C prime is basically marginal propensity to consume out of only disposable income. And we know that MPC is greater than 0 but less than 1. So 1 minus MPC, the numerator is basically positive. Okay, the numerator is positive here. Okay, this is basically the reciprocal of our multiplier value. Remember, the multiplier was equal to 1 by 1 minus MPC. Okay, so this is actually 1 minus MPC in the numerator. Okay, and I prime we know because the investment function is downward sloping, so I prime is basically negative. That means there is an inverse relationship between investment and rate of interest. So the slope is basically negative because the numerator is positive and the denominator is negative. So the slope is negative. So using simple mathematics, you can easily show that IS curve, slope of the IS curve is negative. That is, IS curve is downward sloping. Okay. But we are not just interested to know, I mean, the slope of the IS curve. I mean, the slope means the sign of the IS curve, because that is pretty clear. I mean, it is going to be negative. So, but we want to know whether what is the I mean, how it, whether it is too steep or flat. I mean, the curvature of exactly the slope of the IS curve we want to know. In this slide, we are going to discuss the curvature of the IS curve. The curvature means whether it's a flat one, when it is a flatter one, when it is a steeper one, and you will understand why we are interested in the exact curvature of the IS curve when we will be discussing different government policies, effectiveness of different government policies. But for the time being, let's understand on what factors the slope of the IS curve depend. Uh, if you consider the mathematical expression of the slope of the IS itself, then you will understand on what factors the slope is the slope depend. One is, as you can see from here, one thing is pretty clear, that it is negative. I mean, we are not concerned about the sign of the uh, expression, and that we know already that it is negative and it is downward sloping. But whether it is like a very flat curve like say this, or a very steep curve like this. Okay, so we just want to understand that for the time and here in this slide. So if you consider the expression itself, you will find that there are two factors that are influencing the slope. Okay, the value of the slope. Okay, one is I prime. I mean, forget about the sign itself, it is negative, but let's consider the absolute value, because I prime is in the denominator. So higher I prime means, so more I prime means your slope is low, right? That means your IS curve is flat. So that's why what we're saying is the IS curve will be relatively flat, okay, if investment is more sensitive to interest rate. I mean, higher I prime means what? Higher I prime means if there is a change in rate of interest, we know the relationship. If R increases, then I will fall, and vice versa. That is, if R falls, I will increase. But how much? By how much? By what amount? So that is determined by the responsiveness of the curve of the investment function. If there is an increase in R and if R falls by a small amount, that means the curve is not that responsive. In that case, I prime is very small. If R increases and I falls by a big, huge amount, that means the investment curve is very responsive, and therefore I prime is the value of I prime is the absolute value of I prime is very high. Okay, so therefore more responsive investment function or more sensitivity of the investment function with respect to interest rate, that means higher I prime, higher value of I prime. And because I prime is in the denominator, so higher value of I prime in the denominator means the slope is lower. The whole value is lower. And as you know, if the slope is lower means the curve is flatter. Okay, and it's more flat like this. Higher the I prime, it's going to be more flat. So and the reverse is also true. If it is less sensitive, so if I prime is low, therefore slope is pretty high, and therefore your IS curve will be steep. So in the bracket we are considering just the opposite one. So you read it like this: the IS curve will be relatively flat if investment is more sensitive, or you can read it like this: the IS curve will be relatively steep. What is written within the bracket, if investment is less sensitive to interest rate. So one factor that is determining the sensitivity of or the slope of the IS curve is I prime. And now let's understand why this is happening. This is happening because of the simple reason that remember the product market equilibrium condition, how it was working. The product market equilibrium condition was Y was equal to consumption, which was a function of, I should have written it here, which was a function of YT minus TY, whatever. I'm writing it instead of that. I'm writing it YD as disposable income. Then investment as a function of rate of interest plus government expenditure, which is exogenously given. Okay, given this, how we were deriving IS curve, we were considering one R and then we were getting one Y corresponding Y, right? So, and if you reduce R, then what was the logic, how it was working? If you reduce R, then I will increase, and because an increase in I means increase in aggregate demand, so Y will increase. Now, if your investment function is very sensitive, what will happen? If you reduce R, your investment will increase by a bigger amount, okay, by a large amount, because the investment function is sensitive. If it is more sensitive the investment function is, higher will be the change in investment, and therefore given other things, increase in income will be higher, like this. Okay, because this is more sensitive, increase in investment will be higher, and therefore income will also increase by a higher amount. Just like this, consider point E0, it's the initial point. Say E0 is the initial point here. R0 was the rate of interest and Y0 is the initial equilibrium income. Now reduce your rate of interest from R0 to R1. If your investment is less sensitive, then investment will increase by a lesser amount. Okay, by a lesser amount. I'm using only one arrow. And therefore income will increase from Y0 to Y1. This one. And so if you consider this R1 Y1 as another point, and you join E0 and E1, you get IS curve. Okay, now consider, just increase the sensitivity of the investment function. Instead of the previous one, in previous one means what we considered earlier. Now say your investment function is more sensitive than before, then what will happen? If you lower R again, just from R0 to R1 like this, you are lowering the R by the same amount, but because your investment function is more sensitive, investment will increase by a larger amount than before. So therefore I am using two arrows here. And if your investment increases by a larger amount, your income will also increase by a larger amount. So instead of income increasing from Y0 to Y1, maybe income will increase from Y0 to Y2. And therefore you are getting the second equilibrium point at E2 instead of E1. Now if you join E0 and E2, you will get a curve which is flatter than the earlier one, and that is IS1 or IS prime here. So what kind of result you are getting? The result is when you consider more sensitive investment function, your IS curve is flatter like this. IS prime is flatter than IS. So this is what we have already written here, that IS curve will be relatively flat if investment is more sensitive to interest rate. And if you go on increasing the sensitivity of the investment function, it will be more flat. It will be more flat like this. And what is the logical extension of that? What is the most flattest possible IS curve would be? A horizontal. When it can be horizontal. It can be horizontal means your I prime is so sensitive, that means is the maximum possible sensitivity, that we call infinitely elastic investment function. That means your I prime is basically infinite. The value of I prime is infinite. If you put infinite here, then something by infinite or 1 by infinite is basically 0. That means your slope is going to be 0 in that case, and slope of IS curve 0 means the IS curve is horizontal. So that's the maximum possible. So that's the maximum possible sensitivity of investment function. And if investment function is perfectly elastic, infinitely elastic, therefore I prime is tends to infinity, and therefore slope tends to 0. So your IS curve is basically horizontal. This is one possible, extreme value of I prime. Another possibility is investment is not sensitive to interest rate at all. That means if you raise your interest rate or lower your interest rate, investment is not responding at all. Investment is not sensitive at all. That means what? Investment, the sensitivity is equal to 0. So that means when you lower your interest rate, there is no change in investment. And if there is no change in investment, there is no change in Y as well. So therefore, even if you consider a lower R, your Y is actually not increasing. This is not happening. In that case, you will have the second point, which is here maybe. And in that case, your IS curve is going to be vertical like this. This is another extreme. Okay, this is possible when the investment function is not sensitive at all. Just consider I prime equal to 0. No sensitivity means I prime is equal to 0. And if you put I prime equal to 0, so something by 0, this is what? This is tends to infinity, undefined, and that means this is vertical. Okay, so I prime is vertical, so IS curve is vertical. I mean, these are two extremes. IS curve can be horizontal if I prime tends to infinity, and IS curve is vertical when I prime is equal to 0. There is no sensitivity at all. So this is how you explain the slope of the IS curve in terms of sensitivity of IS curve. Now there is another factor which is influencing the slope of the IS curve, and that is, from the mathematical expression itself you can get that, and that is basically here, that is 1 minus C prime into 1 minus T prime, and more importantly, I mean more with you can consider C prime into 1 minus T prime. That means MPC. if your MPC is higher, as you can see from here, if your MPC is higher, because this is MPC, so the numerator is going to be smaller, because this is 1 minus MPC. So higher MPC means your numerator is smaller, therefore your slope is smaller. Okay, the value of the slope is smaller, and that means the curve is flatter. So what I am writing here is higher the MPC, flatter is the highest curve. Why this is happening? Same logic. Think of a situation where you are lowering R. Okay, when you lower R, because this time we are not talking about sensitivity of investment function. Investment will increase by some amount. We are not considering that. Okay, any amount. So if investment increases, then we know Y will increase. But by what amount Y is going to increase? That will be determined by the value of the multiplier, right? Because this is when R is increasing, that means aggregate demand is increasing. And if aggregate demand increases, Y will increase by multiplier into aggregate demand amount, change in aggregate demand amount. So as we know that the value of the multiplier is determined by MPC, and from our previous discussions we know that the value of the multiplier is 1 by 1 minus MPC. So higher the MPC, higher is the value of the multiplier, and higher will be the change in income. So if the MPC is smaller, Y will increase by a smaller amount. When you lower R from R0 to R1, Y will increase from Y0 to maybe Y1. So IS will be your IS curve. Okay. But if your multiplier is higher, is very high, that means if your MPC is very high, then what will happen? For the same change in interest rate and investment, so interest rate is falling from R0 to R1 and investment is also increasing by some amount, but because your multiplier is higher, the value of the multiplier is higher, therefore your income will increase by a larger amount. So therefore you will get Y0, change in Y from Y0 to Y2 instead of Y0 to Y1. So the second point will be, instead of E1, the second point will be E2, and therefore your IS curve will be IS prime when your MPC is higher. So we are getting two factors that are influencing slope of the IS curve. One is MPC, or you can say the multiplier itself. Higher the MPC, that means higher the multiplier, and therefore smaller is the slope. Because remember, we are talking about slope where the numerator is basically presented by the reciprocal of the multiplier. So higher the multiplier means this value is smaller, and therefore your slope is also small. That means IS curve is flatter like this. Okay, and this is smaller means if the multiplier is pretty small, then this will be this value will be higher, and therefore your slope will be higher, and therefore the IS curve will be pretty steep. Okay, and the second factor, in fact the first factor in terms of our pointing. So the first factor was the sensitivity of the investment function. More sensitive the investment curve, flatter the IS curve. So on two factors, slope of the IS curve is basically the slope of the IS curve is basically determined by two factors. Okay. So here we are going to discuss another aspect of another property or aspect of IS curve. It is like what if we consider a point which is off the IS curve, that is, which is not on the IS curve. Okay, so we know that IS curve means, when we consider IS curve, we know that that means all the points on the curve. Okay, all the points, there are numerous points, there are millions of points, there are thousands of points, Hajar Dr. Hajar. Remember the Sonar Kella film? So there were Hajar Dr. Hajra, and on IS curve we have Hajar equilibrium points. Okay, just digressing a little bit. Okay, so on the curve, if you move along the curve, all the points, they signify product market equilibrium condition. That means if you consider a point which is off the curve, say point A here, which is above the curve, that means you have disequilibrium here. The product market is not equilibrium at point A. Or if you consider a point which is below the IS curve, say at point B, okay, this is also signifies product market disequilibrium. We just want to know that what type of disequilibrium is there in point A or in point B, because there are two types of points possible here. One is above the curve and another one is below the curve. Okay, if you can understand what is happening at A, we can understand what will happen at point B. Just the reverse will be true in B, if you can understand A. Okay, so remember, when we say that the product market is in equilibrium, that means in equilibrium, what is happening? In equilibrium, the product market is in equilibrium if aggregate supply is equal to aggregate demand. Okay. So the product market is not in equilibrium. That means aggregate supply is not equal to aggregate demand. So any point of the curve, that is any point which is not on the IS curve, that means either your aggregate supply is greater than aggregate demand, like this, or your aggregate demand is greater than your aggregate supply. Because if it is equal, then they are in equilibrium. That should have been on the curve. Okay, A is not on the curve, so therefore must be either aggregate supply is greater than aggregate demand or aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply. We just want to know what exactly happened at point E. To know that, we just draw a perpendicular line from A to the y-axis and name it y0. And the point it cuts the where it cuts the IS curve, name it E. Okay. Now consider point A with point E. Just do this thing. Remember, at A, y at A is exactly equal to y at E because they are on same vertical line. So at E, y is y0. Okay. But at A and at A, y is also at y0. So aggregate supply at A, because y is aggregate supply at A is exactly equal to aggregate supply at E. And remember, E is an equilibrium point. Okay, this is small e actually. Okay, E is an equilibrium point, but A is not. And now consider rate of interest at A with rate of interest at E. Rate of interest at E is basically R0. Okay, and rate of interest at A is basically R1, and we know from the graph that R1 is greater than R0. If R1 is greater than R0, then investment with respect to R1 must be less than investment with respect to R0, because the relationship is negative, right? Because the relationship, because the investment function is negatively sloped. So if R1 is, if R is higher, investment is lower. And if this is true, then we can say that investment at point A is basically lower than investment at point E. And because investment is an aggregate demand component, so we can say aggregate demand at point A is basically less than aggregate demand at point E. So how we are explaining this? This is pretty simple. What we are doing is we are comparing point A with point E. And if you compare them, what you are getting? You are getting at E your rate of interest is R0, at A your rate of interest is R1, because at A your rate of interest is higher, and therefore at A your investment is going to be smaller. If your investment is smaller, your aggregate demand is also lower or smaller. Okay. And now remember, At E, your aggregate supply is exactly equal to aggregate demand because you are on the curve. You are on the IS curve. So your aggregate demand is exactly equal to aggregate supply. But here your aggregate supply is just as at point E, but your aggregate demand is less than what it is at point E. So there must be excess supply at point A, excess supply in the goods market. ESG means excess supply in the product market or the goods market. Because remember here aggregate supply is exactly Y0, but your aggregate demand at A is lower than the equilibrium aggregate demand, and therefore here your supply is basically greater than demand, and therefore you have excess supply. And if there is excess supply, what the producers are going to react? What does excess supply means? Excess supply means whatever you are producing, you are not able to sell it, and therefore there is excess supply. So what you will do? You will cut back your production and you will move towards this. Okay, you will cut back your production, your supply will fall. Okay, and therefore this is the disequilibrium point. You will move towards the equilibrium point, okay, towards this IS curve. So the movement will be leftward. Okay, this is how this disequilibrium will be corrected and the movement will be towards the IS curve. Similarly, you can follow exactly the similar logic and you consider a point which is below the IS curve at point B, and you do the same. You draw a vertical line and you consider point B and the point which is cutting the IS curve, and then you do the same. What you will find? Just the opposite. Okay, because there is excess supply of goods at point A, you will find excess demand for goods at point B, because this is below the curve. Because B, you will have lower interest rate compared to the comparable point on the curve. So what you will have is higher demand at B than the equilibrium point, and therefore there will be excess demand for goods. And if there is excess demand in the goods market, so the supply is lower, demand is higher, so the producers will try to produce more to, you know, to utilize that excess demand. So income will rise. So that means you will move horizontally like this towards this IS curve. This is how the movement will happen. So this is how we explain, if there is disequilibrium, if you consider a point which is not in equilibrium, then how it is going to, what type of disequilibrium is that, whether there is excess supply or excess demand, and then how it is going to move towards the equilibrium point. This is the last slide of this part 2 of our ISLM series. Here we are going to discuss how IS curve is going to behave with respect to a change in any fiscal policy. Say for example, change in government expenditure. Okay, just think of the initial. Just keep in mind the derivation of the IS curve. Then you will understand that. Say this is the initial aggregate demand curve. Okay, this is your initial aggregate demand. AD is 0, and your IS curve is at IS 0 like this. It's a downward sloping curve at IS 0. Okay, it's like this. This is your IS. Now what you do, if the government decides to increase expenditure, what will happen? We don't know yet what is going to happen to the economy, because we don't know where the economy is. Okay, that we are not doing here, because we know the IS curve, we know the product market equilibrium schedule. That is, we know some points of product market equilibrium, some equilibrium points, not exactly where the economy is. We don't know that. Okay, we don't know where the economy is, but what we want to know is, say this is your aggregate demand line. You are right, you are drawing this with respect to a specific R. So aggregate demand is equal to consumption, which is a function of disposable income, plus investment with respect to a specific R, and then G0. Okay, G0 is your initial government expenditure, and there you are getting IS curve at IS 0. Okay, this is your R bar. You are not changing R. Okay. Now, if the government decides to increase its expenditure, what will happen? This will be your new aggregate demand line. Okay. Instead of AD0, you are having now AD1, which is equal to C plus I as before. But government expenditure has changed from G0 bar to G1 bar. This is the change in government expenditure. So as you know, through multiplier, the income will increase from Y0 to Y1. How do you capture that in terms of IS curve? You capture that in terms of IS curve because your R is constant. So that means along a constant R, Y is increasing. So to capture that, you'll have to shift the IS curve towards rightwards. Okay. So whenever there is a government policy which is expansionary, which increases aggregate demand, like this, like a change in government expenditure, your IS curve will shift rightward. And when you take a policy which is contractionary, you lower government expenditure like this, okay, or you increase your tax, there will be a leftward shift of the IS curve, parallel shift of the IS curve. So just keep that in mind, okay, for the time being. We are not going to do anything with this right now because we don't know whether economy is exactly, we don't know the equilibrium point itself. But for the time being, we'll have to keep in mind that if there is a change in expenditure, G bar, say if G increases, then IS curve will shift rightward. And if there is a fall in, government expenditure, if G falls, if government, decides to reduce its expenditure, you'll have to capture that in terms of a leftward shift of the IS curve. And if you consider a fiscal policy which is a tax cut or an increase in tax, if tax increases, that means you are talking about a contractionary policy, because an increase in tax, you will have to just understand whether the policy is going to increase aggregate demand or reduce aggregate demand. Because if there is an increase in tax, that's going to reduce aggregate demand. So that means that's a contractionary policy. And in case of a contractionary policy, IS curve is going to shift leftward. And if the government decides to cut its tax, then what will happen? A tax cut means what? A tax cut means aggregate demand will increase. We have already discussed them in our simple Keynesian discussion on multiplier. So if there is a tax cut, if aggregate demand increases, so that means it's an expansionary fiscal policy. That means you can capture that in terms of a rightward shift or this kind of a shift of the IS curve from IS0 to IS1. Okay, so this is important. And you need to understand why this is happening from this graph, from the graph we have already discussed, from here to here, how this is happening. Okay. And when we will be discussing the multipliers, then this logic will be relevant. Okay. But for the time being, keep this in mind that if there is an expansionary policy, IS curve is going to shift rightward. If there is a contractionary policy, IS curve is going to shift leftward. Okay. So that's all for the time being. Next class we are going to discuss, because I told you that in this model, in this ISLM model, we'll have to have another market to solve our two unknown problem, because IS curve is only representing the product market, and in the product market we have the problem of only one equation with two unknowns. So we'll have to introduce another market, another equation with same two unknowns, so that we can solve two unknowns from those two equations. So next class we are going to discuss money market, and from the money market equilibrium condition we'll introduce actually money market. You don't know anything about this particular market, so we are going to introduce money market, how it works, what are the components of money market, what do you mean by money demand, what do you mean by money supply, because ultimately the equilibrium will be determined by demand and supply. That we know, that's the basic principle, right? So next class we are going to discuss a money market and how do you how do you derive this equilibrium condition of money demand is equal to money supply, and then from there we'll derive another curve which will be termed as LM curve. So the next class is on LM curve. This is next. Okay, so we are going to discuss that in our next class.